In a business where most rappers spend more energy pretending to still be winning than actually winning, Curtis Jackson just did what he has done for 2 straight decades. He waited until his rival stepped on a landmine, and then he walked over with a match. Because the second the world learned that 50 Cent was bringing the Gunit Reebok sneakers back from the vault, one man could not help himself. One man had to say something. One man had to tap the microphone before anybody else could speak. And that man, of course, was Rick Ross. What Rick Ross did next, and what happened to Rick Ross in the 72 hours after he did it, is one of the wildest self-inflicted collapses hip-hop has watched in real time this year. And once you see how deep the damage cuts, once you see who came out of the shadows to twist the knife, and once you see the number that lit the fuse, you are not going to believe what the algorithm did to Rick Ross next. So sit tight, because this one gets ugly, and it gets ugly fast. Everything that happened this week started with a sneaker. That was it. A sneaker announcement. 50 Cent confirmed that the legendary Gunit Reeboks, the shoes that once printed money for Curtis Jackson, Lloyd Banks, and Tony Yayo, were coming back into circulation, and the internet lit up within minutes. Fans who wore those sneakers in high school were suddenly in group chats, sending each other the news. Sneaker resellers started refreshing their pages. And somewhere in Miami, Rick Ross was scrolling on his phone, and Rick Ross could not resist the itch. Rick Ross went straight to his Instagram story and posted a line that has since been screenshotted 1,000 times over. Rick Ross wrote, "Costco got these now. Lloyd Banks high tops better." And then, because Rick Ross is Rick Ross, he tagged the post with a track from his new album, because every jab has to double as a promo. It was petty. It was quick. It was classic Rosie. And for about 6 hours, the internet gave him a small chuckle, because that is the routine. 50 Cent does something. Rick Ross reacts. Everybody moves on. Except this time, nobody moved on. Because the moment that Instagram story dropped, a chain reaction started that Rick Ross could not have predicted, and the chain reaction did not stop with 50 Cent. It stopped with the entire ecosystem around Rick Ross, his own former artists, his own former collaborators, his own numbers, his own tour, his own history, and every single piece of that ecosystem opened its mouth in the same week. This was not a feud flare-up. This was a coordinated funeral. And the man at the center of it never saw it coming, because Rick Ross was too busy trying to promote an album that was already sinking under his feet. That album is called Set in Stone. It dropped on July 17th. It packed 19 tracks, features from T.I., Gucci Mane, French Montana, and a long list of familiar names, and on paper it looked like a boss-level release from an artist who has been calling himself the biggest boss for 2 decades. But paper lies. And when the first week reporting numbers rolled in, Rick Ross' entire narrative cracked in half. Set in Stone debuted at number 45 on the Billboard 200. Number 45. Roughly 17,200 units in the opening week, and only about 2,000 of those came from actual album purchases. The rest was streaming activity and equivalent chart-eligible bundles. For an artist whose catalog once opened with 218,000 copies in a single week, this was not a slow start. This was a collapse. And it happened in front of an audience that was already loading the memes. Because here is the part that made 50 Cent's teeth show. In the same week, Rick Ross was projected to sell under 26,000 units of a rapper named Tory Lanez, who is currently sitting behind prison walls with no radio push, no interview run, no red carpet promo, no photo shoots, no touring. Dropped his own project and moved 19,700 units. Tory Lanez, from a jail cell, with zero motion, outsold Ricky Rosie. Take that in for a moment. Because the entire Gunit camp certainly did. Tony Yayo was the first one to grab the microphone. Yayo went on his podcast and said what everybody had been thinking. Yayo pointed out that Rick Ross had done the interview circuit, done the promo run, done the album rollout, done the podcast tour, and still could not outmove a man broadcasting from a prison. Yayo told Rick Ross that Rick Ross needed the Drake stimulus package that never came. Yayo told Rick Ross that beefing with 50 Cent was never a good business plan. And Yayo delivered the punchline that ended up plastered across 100 rap blogs. Yayo told Rick Ross to find a new career. And once Yayo said it, the tone was set. The gloves were off. Everybody with something to say about Rick Ross realized this was the moment to say it, because the numbers gave them permission. That is how these things work in hip-hop. When your bag is heavy, nobody speaks. When your bag is light, everybody speaks. 50 Cent did not need long. Curtis Jackson has been waiting for this moment for years, and he was not going to fumble it. 50 Cent hopped on Instagram, looked at the first week projections, and posted the line that lit the fuse. 50 Cent wrote, "So when your tickets don't sell and your album don't sell, what do? And then, because Curtis is Curtis, he followed it up. Another post. Another dagger. This one read, "Promote car shows and sell chicken wings, LOL." And then, and this is the part where you have to appreciate the surgery of it, 50 Cent dug into the archives and pulled up an old clip of Rick Ross bragging that Set in Stone was going to be a smash. 50 Cent captioned the throwback, "That was a firecracker. Only friends and family got it." Within an hour, screenshots were everywhere. Within 3 hours, every hip-hop page on Instagram had posted it. Within 24 hours, comment sections were painted with 50,000 laughing emojis. And Rick Ross, the man who built his entire brand on the illusion of untouchable wealth, was suddenly being clowned across the timeline like he was a rookie. But here is where the whole thing tilted into something bigger than a normal 50 versus Ross exchange. Because while Rick Ross was still trying to figure out how to spin the sails, a much older, much heavier voice stepped forward. His name is Gunplay. And what Gunplay said cut deeper than anything 50 Cent could ever tweet. For years, Gunplay was considered one of the most loyal soldiers in the entire Maybach Music Group army. Gunplay defended Rick Ross when it was unpopular. Gunplay was in the middle of the notorious altercation at the 2012 BET Hip Hop Awards, an altercation that pitted him directly against the Gunit camp. Gunplay took the hits. Gunplay stayed in uniform when other artists jumped ship. Gunplay was, in every sense of the word, family. So when Gunplay finally sat down on a podcast this year and opened his mouth about MMG, the culture stopped scrolling and started listening. Because loyalty does not talk. And when loyalty finally talks, it is because something broke. Gunplay said the words plainly. Gunplay said, everybody was a group effort. When it was Gunplay's turn, it was crickets. Gunplay said he had hit records nobody would fund. Gunplay said no budget. No push. No campaign. Gunplay said his hands were tied because every decision ran through the big dog, and if the big dog did not want to move, nothing moved. And then Gunplay delivered the sentence that turned the entire conversation upside down. Gunplay compared Rick Ross' leadership to 50 Cent's, and Gunplay gave 50 Cent the trophy. Gunplay said 50 Cent built up Lloyd Banks, Tony Yayo, and the game while running Gunit. Gunplay said the difference was obvious. Gunplay said the loyalty went one way. Coming from any random artist, that quote is a shrug. Coming from Gunplay, the man who caught bullets for Rick Ross, that quote is a wound. And the wound is not closing. Now, look at what Rick Ross had to say for himself in the middle of all this. Because Rick Ross did not go quiet. Rick Ross went to a podcast to defend the album, and instead of talking about his own music, Rick Ross spent his energy taking swings at 50 Cent's Shreveport studio project. Rick Ross asked how Shreveport was going. Rick Ross asked if 50 Cent had paid back the people. Rick Ross went after 50 Cent's business dealings, mocked the film studio idea, and even offered, with a smile, to sit 50 Cent down at a table and hear out his renderings like a mentor granting an audience. It should have been a devastating shot. It should have flipped the narrative. It didn't. It didn't because the second Rick Ross opened his mouth about Shreveport, the entire timeline reminded him about one specific number. $80 million. Because in 2012, when 50 Cent sat down with Big Boy, Curtis Jackson said on tape that his Reebok sneaker deal had earned him roughly $80 million over the course of the partnership. $80 million. Not projected. Not rumored. Stated. On camera. In 2012. Meaning by the time the Gunit sneaker relaunch dropped this year, that number was already outdated by more than a decade of licensing, resales, and brand equity. Rick Ross could joke about Costco. Rick Ross could joke about Lloyd Banks. But Rick Ross could not joke about $80 million because Rick Ross does not have a public sneaker check to match it. That is math. And math does not care about punchlines. But the real damage, the deep damage, the damage Rick Ross is still trying to survive, did not come from 50 Cent, and did not come from Gunplay, and did not come from Tony Yayo. The real damage came from something much colder. The real damage came from the algorithm. This is the part nobody wants to say out loud, so let me be the one to say it. Rick Ross is being punished by the system. Not the industry. The system. The recommendation engine. The invisible hand that decides which artist gets pushed to the front of your feed and which artist gets buried under 1,000 cat videos. And the reason Rick Ross is being punished, according to a growing chorus of commentators including DJ Akademiks, is because Rick Ross made the one mistake modern rap does not forgive. Rick Ross turned on Drake. Think about the math for a second. Drake commands, by conservative estimates, somewhere between 60 and 70% of hip-hop's most active audience. Ross fans and Drake fans overlapped almost completely for a decade. Every Ross fan was a Drake fan. Not every Drake fan was a Ross fan. So the moment Rick Ross picked a lane against Drake, the fanbase math turned into subtraction. 50 to 80% of Rick Ross' streaming base, the people who used to press play on a Ross track because a Drake feature was on it, or because they associated Rosie with luxury rap the same way they associated it with Drake, gone. Not slowly. Immediately. The moment Rick Ross took the shot at Iceman, the moment Rick Ross called Drake's album horrendous, the moment Rick Ross tried to plant himself as the anti-Drake elder statesman, his own algorithmic pipeline dried up. Because streaming platforms do not care about lyrics. Streaming platforms care about behavior. And the behavior of Drake's audience is to stop clicking on artists who insult Drake. That is not a theory. That is a measurable pattern. And Rick Ross triggered it. DJ Akademiks put it perfectly. Akademiks said hip-hop media is in shambles right now because half the industry does not know whose side to stand on, whose apology to accept, whose bag to protect. And Akademiks said Rick Ross is a case study of what happens when you pick the losing side in a war whose winner had already been declared. Because Drake did not lose the war people think Drake lost. Drake lost the round. Drake did not lose the empire. And Rick Ross treated a round loss like an empire collapse, and Rick Ross built an entire promotional identity around dancing on a grave that was never dug. The result of that miscalculation is currently sitting at number 45 on the Billboard 200. Now let me put the receipts on the table because a lot of people forget where Rick Ross used to live on that chart. In 2012, God Forgives, I Don't opened with roughly 218,000 units in a week, hit number 1, and cemented Rick Ross as one of the most bankable album artists in mainstream rap. 2 years later, Mastermind opened with about 179,000 units and hit number 1 again. That was the peak. That was the version of Rick Ross the culture remembers. Fast forward. 2019, Port of Miami 2 debuts with about 80,000 first-week units. Still a number 2 placement, still respectable, but the trend line is bending. 2021, Richer Than I Ever Been drops. Around 30,000 first-week units. Number 22 on the Billboard 200. That is a canyon. Then 2023 arrives. Rick Ross teams up with Meek Mill on Too Good to Be True, and the pair barely nudge the needle. 31,000 units. 50 Cent watched that number and posted publicly, oh no, 31,090. You might want to spend some quiet time to strategize and reevaluate. That post was ignored at the time. It reads a lot different today. And now, in 2026, we get set in stone. 17,200 units. Number 45. Compared to God Forgives, I Don't, that is a decline of over 92% across roughly 14 years. 92%. Even if you account for the industry-wide shift to streaming, even if you factor in changing consumption habits, even if you give Rick Ross the widest possible statistical grace, the pattern is undeniable. The bag has gotten lighter every single release cycle. And when the bag gets light, the wolves show up. The wolves are already here. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Because Rick Ross is not just failing on the charts. Rick Ross is failing on the road. Videos circulating online right now show what his Miami tour stop looks like on the ticketing map, and the map is a sea of green. Green means unsold. There are more empty seats than filled ones. And Rick Ross' team, in what has been described as a full-blown panic move, is now openly offering buy one get 50% off ticket promotions to move inventory. Rick Ross, Miami, his own city, discount tickets. That is not a bad week. That is a brand collapse in slow motion. And listen, this is the point where you have to be honest. Because the temptation is to blame Rick Ross management, or Rick Ross rollout, or the label. But somebody said the truth out loud, and the truth is uncomfortable. Somebody asked, who told Rick Ross it was a good idea to disappear from music for 2 decades, come back with a full-length album, and then try to launch a world tour? Because that is what actually happened. The Rick Ross the culture wants to see on stage is the 2010 Rick Ross. The Aston Martin music Rick Ross. The Teflon Don Rick Ross. The Rick Ross whose voice was on every summer radio playlist and every strip club playlist and every gym playlist in the country. That version of Rick Ross does not exist anymore. That version of Rick Ross has been aging out in real time while the audience aged out with him. And a comeback tour, without singles that landed, without a viral moment, without a cultural runway, that is not a tour. That is a boarding gate at an empty airport. Even Lil Wayne, when he tried to relaunch after his Cash Money war, could not get the culture to rewind. And Lil Wayne is Lil Wayne. If Wayne can't reboot cold, what were the odds Rick Ross was going to? The math never worked. The people around Rick Ross had to know that. And yet the album shipped, the tour got announced, and the numbers landed exactly where the math said they would land. Now, let me steelman Rick Ross for a second, because it is only fair. Rick Ross has 2 objectively classic albums in his catalog with 0 Drake involvement, Teflon Don and Deeper Than Rap. He was not built by Drake. He was augmented by Drake. The Drake features made the biggest singles bigger, but the ceiling of Rick Ross art was already established before Drake showed up. So the idea that Rick Ross is nothing without Drake is not accurate. What is accurate, and this is the part Rick Ross has to admit privately, even if he never says it publicly, is that Rick Ross' commercial ceiling was inflated by the Drake era, and puncturing that alliance shrank the ceiling permanently. There is no bringing back the shared audience. There is no negotiating that back. Once you swing on Drake in 2026, that door is welded shut. Especially since Drake, from every indication, has no interest in reopening it. And that brings us all the way back to Gunplay. Because in the middle of the sales collapse, in the middle of 50 Cent's Dagger campaign, in the middle of Tony Yayo's post-mortem, there is Gunplay, quietly telling the truth about how it always was inside MMG. Look at the roster history. Whale, Meek Mill, Stally, Rocky Fresh, Amarian, Gunplay. 2 of them broke through. The rest? Delays. Stalled projects. Silence. Whispers about budgets that never materialized. Meanwhile, Rick Ross himself put out album after album after album. God Forgives, Mastermind, Hood Billionaire, Black Market, Rather You Than Me, Port of Miami 2, Richer Than I Ever Been, Too Good to Be True, and now Set in Stone. And when you put Gunplay's confession side by side with the Set in Stone numbers, side by side with 50 Cent's Chicken Wing post, side by side with the empty Miami venue, side by side with the Tory Lanez outsell, the picture stops looking like a bad week and starts looking like a reckoning. Here is what most people miss about a reckoning, though. A reckoning is not the end of a career. A reckoning is a chapter break. Rick Ross still owns a portfolio that most rappers would trade 3 albums to have. Multiple Wingstop franchises. Real estate across the country. Investment ventures that print income while he sleeps. Financially, Rick Ross is not a rapper anymore. Rick Ross is a small business empire wearing a chain. And that empire is going to keep paying whether Set in Stone hits gold or hits the discount bin. The music is a hobby by now. The image is what needed the sales. And the image just took a public swing to the jaw. which raises the question the algorithm cannot answer for him. Does Rick Ross need to still be putting out full-length rap albums? Because every time he does it in the current era, the discourse is not about the bars, or the beats, or the guest verses, or the storytelling. The discourse is about the sales chart, the empty seats, and the guys taking shots at him from every direction. And that is not a music release cycle. That is a public relations problem cosplaying as a music release cycle. If Rick Ross keeps forcing full album drops into a fan base that no longer streams him at scale, he is just handing 50 Cent free ammunition every 12 months. And Curtis Jackson has proven, decade after decade, that he never misses when the ammunition is free. Meanwhile, 50 Cent's own trajectory keeps widening the gap. Curtis is not releasing chart-chasing albums anymore. Curtis is not begging for radio spins. Curtis is producing television, running film ventures, licensing his brand across whiskey, tequila, and shoe partnerships, and building infrastructure in cities like Shreveport. Even when Rick Ross swings at those ventures, he is swinging at real assets, not vibes. And that is the difference between a rapper who diversified before the algorithm turned on him and a rapper who is still trying to relive the mid-2000s while the market moved 15 exits down the highway. Zoom out one more time and the picture becomes even clearer. This is not really a story about a sneaker announcement. This is a story about what happens when an artist confuses relevance with revenge. Rick Ross had a choice this year. He could have used Set in Stone to remind the culture what Rosary sounds like at his sharpest. He could have leaned into the storytelling, the production ear, the mafioso mythology that built him. Instead, Rick Ross used most of his press cycle to swing at old rivals. He reignited the 50 Cent feud. He questioned Drake's pen. He threw a stray shot in Jay-Z's direction. He tried to be the villain in 3 different movies at the same time. And when the album finally shipped, the fans were not talking about the bars, they were talking about the beef. Which means the album became a bulletin board instead of a body of work. And bulletin boards do not sell. There is a lesson buried inside all of this, and it is not just about Rick Ross. It is about how the modern algorithm punishes distraction. Streaming platforms and recommendation engines reward creators who stay focused on their product. The moment you start using your platform to attack other creators, the algorithm reads that as noise, not signal. Your engagement per post might spike temporarily, but your long-term recommendation score drops because the system is trying to figure out what genre of content you actually make. Are you a music artist? Are you a commentator? Are you a beef merchant? The confusion penalizes you. And Rick Ross confused the system all summer long. Now, does any of this mean Rick Ross is done? Not even close. Rick Ross has been counted out before, and every time he has found a way to keep his name inside the conversation. But the version of Rick Ross that used to open at 200,000 units, that version is not coming back. That version was a product of a specific era, a specific audience, a specific Drake alliance, and a specific radio ecosystem, and all 4 of those pillars have been dismantled. What comes next depends entirely on whether Rick Ross is willing to accept that the game changed, that the algorithm has a memory, and that the loyalty he demanded from his own artists is the same loyalty the audience demanded from him. Because at the end of the day, that is the deepest cut in this entire story. The moment Gunplay stopped defending Rick Ross, the entire mythology of MMG cracked. The moment the numbers dropped, the entire mythology of the biggest boss cracked. And the moment 50 Cent posted promote car shows and sell chicken wings, the entire mythology of untouchable Rosie cracked. 3 cracks in 7 days. That is not a bad week. That is a foundation failing in public. The last question, the one worth watching, is whether Rick Ross rebuilds or whether Rick Ross doubles down. Because artists who double down after a collapse usually collapse a second time. Artists who rebuild quietly, deliberately, off the timeline, sometimes come back sharper than they were. Curtis Jackson is the living example of that second path. And it would be poetic, in a strange kind of way, if the man Rick Ross has been fighting for 20 years ended up being the exact template Rick Ross needs to copy to save his own career. So tell me what you actually think. Is Rick Ross officially cooked, or is Set in Stone just a rough chapter in a bigger story? Was Gunplay right to finally speak up, Or did he cross a loyalty line that MMG artists are not supposed to cross? And here is the one that will start a war in the comments. Did Rick Ross bury himself the second he swung at Drake, or has he been sliding since long before that? Drop your take below. Whether you ride for Rosie, ride for Curtis, ride for the Gunit camp, ride for Drake, or ride for none of the above, this is the conversation the culture is having right now, and the algorithm is watching to see which side gets louder. If you learned something new, if you saw an angle you had not seen before, if you want the next breakdown the second it drops, hit the subscribe button and turn the notification bell on, because the next chapter of this is coming faster than anyone thinks. And if you want to see the exact moment the culture officially turned on Rick Ross, the clip nobody has been willing to break down honestly yet, the suggested video on your screen right now goes there next. Do not miss it, because this story is not over. This story is just getting loud.